Hey everyone, welcome back to our podcast, where we talk about the thoughts that shape our lives, even the uncomfortable ones. I'm Anna, and today we're diving into something very human, but often hidden: harmful thoughts in our minds. You know, those quiet voices that criticize, doubt, or even scare us sometimes. I think a lot of people assume they're alone in experiencing these, but they're actually more common than we admit. So today, Mark and I are going to open up a safe, honest conversation about them, and hopefully make this topic feel a little less intimidating.
Hi everyone, I'm Mark, and I'm really glad we're talking about this today. Harmful thoughts can feel incredibly personal, almost like something we should hide or fix immediately. But the truth is, they're part of being human. What matters is how we understand and respond to them. I think many of us grew up believing that having a negative or intrusive thought says something bad about who we are, which can create even more anxiety. So in this episode, we're not here to judge those thoughts, but to explore them with curiosity and maybe even a bit of compassion.
Exactly. And I think that's such an important point, Mark. Sometimes the fear of having harmful thoughts can be more distressing than the thoughts themselves. We try to push them away or ignore them, and that can actually make them feel stronger. I've personally experienced moments where a random negative thought just stuck in my mind, and I wondered why it wouldn't go away. It's confusing and sometimes even scary. But I've learned that talking about it, even just acknowledging it, can reduce that intensity and help us feel more in control.
I've had similar experiences, and I think many listeners will relate to that feeling of being caught off guard by your own mind. It's strange how our brains can generate thoughts that don't align with our values or intentions. That disconnect can make people question themselves in ways that aren't fair or accurate. What I find fascinating is that these thoughts often don't reflect who we are, but rather how our brains process stress, fear, or uncertainty. Understanding that difference can be a huge step toward not taking every thought so personally.
Yes, and I think that's where a lot of the struggle begins, when we start identifying with every thought we have. We think, if I thought it, it must mean something about me, but that's not always true. Our minds are constantly generating ideas, images, and reactions, many of which are automatic. Some are helpful, and some aren't. Today, we want to gently challenge the idea that every thought deserves belief or attention. Instead, maybe we can learn to observe them without immediately reacting or judging ourselves.
That's a really freeing perspective, Anna. When we start seeing thoughts as events in the mind rather than facts, it creates a bit of space between us and them. And that space is powerful. It allows us to choose how we respond instead of feeling controlled. I think a lot of people are surprised to learn that even very calm, kind, or successful individuals experience harmful thoughts or intrusive thoughts. It's not a sign of weakness. It's just part of how the human brain works under certain conditions.
Absolutely. And I also want to say that this conversation isn't about minimizing how difficult these thoughts can be. They can feel overwhelming, especially when they're repetitive or emotionally charged. If you're dealing with that, you're not alone, and your experience is valid. What we're hoping to do here is create a space where we can talk openly about it without shame, because once we remove that layer of shame, it becomes much easier to understand what's really going on beneath the surface.
I agree, and I think removing shame is one of the most important steps. Shame tends to isolate us and make us feel like we're the only ones dealing with something. But when we hear others talk about similar experiences, it can be incredibly reassuring. It reminds us that we're not broken or abnormal. We're just human. And with the right tools and perspective, we can learn to navigate these thoughts in a healthier way, instead of feeling trapped by them.
And that's really the heart of today's episode: learning how to relate to our thoughts differently, not fighting them constantly, but also not letting them take over. There's a middle ground where we can acknowledge their presence without giving them too much power. It's not always easy, and it definitely takes practice, but it's possible. And even small shifts in how we think about our thoughts can make a big difference in how we feel day to day.
That middle ground is so important, and I think many people rarely talk about. We often hear advice like, just think positive or ignore negative thoughts, but that's not always realistic. Sometimes the goal isn't to eliminate harmful thoughts, but to change our relationship with them. When we stop seeing them as enemies, they often lose some of their intensity. It's a subtle shift, but it can lead to a much calmer and more balanced mindset over time.
I like that idea. Changing the relationship rather than trying to control everything. Because let's be honest, our minds are complex and sometimes unpredictable. Trying to control every single thought can be exhausting. Instead, maybe we can focus on understanding patterns, noticing triggers, and responding with a bit more kindness towards ourselves. That doesn't mean we agree with harmful thoughts, but we don't have to attack ourselves for having them either.
That's such a compassionate approach, Anna, and I think it sets the tone for this entire conversation. Today, we're not here to fix everything in one episode, but to start exploring these ideas together. We'll share perspectives, experiences, and maybe a few practical ways to think about harmful thoughts differently. If you've ever felt overwhelmed by your own mind, this episode is for you. So let's take this step by step and see where this conversation takes us.
So let's start by really understanding what we mean when we say harmful thoughts, because I think that phrase can mean different things to different people. For some, it might be harsh self-criticism, like telling yourself you're not good enough. For others, it could be intrusive thoughts that feel disturbing or completely out of character. What they have in common is that they create distress and often don't reflect what we truly believe. I think it's important to normalize that these thoughts can show up in anyone's mind, regardless of personality, background, or mental health history.
That's a great place to start, Anna. I'd add that harmful thoughts often gain power from how we interpret them. For example, if you have a random negative thought and immediately think, "Why would I think that? Something must be wrong with me," it adds a layer of fear. That reaction can make the thought stick around longer. On the other hand, if you see it as just a passing mental event, it tends to lose intensity. So the thought itself might not be the main problem, but the meaning we attach to it can really shape our experience.
Yes, and I think that interpretation piece is something many of us aren't taught growing up. We're often told to control our thoughts or replace them with positive ones, but not necessarily how to understand them. I remember times when I'd have a negative thought and immediately try to push it away, almost like I was afraid of it. But the more I resisted it, the more persistent it became. It's like the mind doesn't respond well to being forced. That made me realize that maybe awareness and curiosity are more effective than resistance.
That's such a relatable experience, and it actually connects to something psychologists often talk about, which is the idea that suppressing thoughts can backfire. When you try not to think about something, your brain keeps checking whether you're still thinking about it, which ironically keeps it active. It's almost like telling yourself not to think of a pink elephant. Suddenly, that's all you can think about. Harmful thoughts can work the same way. The more we fight them, the more attention we give them, even if that attention is negative.
That example is so simple but so accurate, and I think it highlights how our minds aren't always logical in the way we expect them to be. Sometimes a thought appears without any clear reason, and we try to analyze it too deeply. We ask, where did this come from? What does it say about me? But not every thought has a meaningful explanation. Some are just random mental noise. Learning to accept that randomness can be surprisingly relieving because it takes away the pressure to make sense of everything.
Exactly. And I think that's where people can start to feel a bit more at ease. If not every thought is meaningful, then we don't have to treat each one like a serious message. Another thing to consider is that our brains are wired to look for potential threats. That's part of how we've evolved to survive. So sometimes harmful thoughts are actually exaggerated attempts by the brain to protect us, even if they don't make sense in the moment. Understanding that can shift the way we see these thoughts.
That's such an interesting perspective, seeing harmful thoughts as misguided protection rather than something purely negative. It makes them feel less like enemies and more like signals that something might need attention. Of course, that doesn't mean we follow every thought or believe it, but we can at least acknowledge it without panic. I think that small shift from fear to curiosity can make a huge difference. Instead of reacting immediately, we can pause and ask ourselves what's actually happening in our mind.
I really like that idea of pausing because it creates space between the thought and the reaction. Without that pause, everything happens so quickly that it feels automatic. You have a thought, you believe it, and then you feel something intense. But if you can slow it down, even just a little, you might notice that the thought is just one piece of the experience. It's not the whole story. And that awareness gives you more choice in how you respond, which is incredibly empowering.
And I think that sense of choice is something people really need to hear. When harmful thoughts feel constant, it can seem like there's no way out, like you're stuck with them. But even if we can't always control what thoughts show up, we can learn to influence how we respond to them. That doesn't happen overnight, of course, but it's a skill that can be developed over time. And the first step is simply recognizing that a thought is a thought, not a fact.
That distinction is so important, and yet it's easy to forget in the moment. When a thought feels strong or emotional, it can seem completely true, but feelings aren't always reliable indicators of reality. Our minds can create very convincing narratives. Part of this process is gently questioning those narratives without being harsh on ourselves. Instead of saying, "This thought is wrong," we might say, "This is just one way of looking at things." That approach feels less confrontational and more balanced.
I love that because it keeps the tone kind and non-judgmental. And I think kindness towards ourselves is often missing when we deal with harmful thoughts. We can be incredibly critical of our own minds, which only adds more stress. What if instead we treated ourselves the way we would treat a friend who's struggling? We wouldn't shame them for having a difficult thought. We'd listen, support, and gently help them see other perspectives. Maybe we deserve that same level of understanding.
I completely agree, and I think that's a powerful way to reframe things. Self-compassion doesn't mean we agree with harmful thoughts or let them take over, but it does mean we stop attacking ourselves for having them. That alone can reduce a lot of the emotional weight. When we're less reactive and more understanding, the thoughts often become less overwhelming. It's a gradual shift, but it can change the entire experience of what's happening in our minds.
Now that we've talked about what harmful thoughts are and how they work, I think it's important to explore why they sometimes feel so powerful. Because even when we understand that a thought isn't necessarily true, it can still feel very real in the moment. I've noticed that certain situations, like stress, lack of sleep, or emotional overwhelm, can make these thoughts much louder. It's almost like the mind becomes more sensitive and reactive. So maybe part of the issue isn't just the thought itself, but the state we're in when it appears.
That's a really insightful point, Anna. Our mental and physical states play a huge role in how we experience thoughts. When we're tired or stressed, our ability to step back and think clearly is reduced. The brain shifts into a more reactive mode, which can amplify negative or harmful thinking. It's not that the thoughts are suddenly more true, but they feel more convincing. I think recognizing those patterns can help people feel less confused. Instead of thinking, "Why am I like this?" we can start asking, "What's going on around me right now?"
Yes, that shift in questioning can make things feel much more manageable. Instead of turning inward with criticism, we look at the bigger picture. I've found it helpful to notice patterns over time. For example, if I'm feeling anxious or overwhelmed, I'm more likely to have thoughts that are critical or fearful. When I'm well rested and calm, those same thoughts don't have as much impact. That realization helped me stop taking them so personally. It showed me that thoughts can be influenced by context, not just by who I am as a person.
That awareness is incredibly valuable because it creates a sense of predictability. If you know that certain conditions make harmful thoughts more likely, you can prepare for them or respond differently when they show up. Another thing I think is worth mentioning is repetition. The more a certain thought pattern repeats, the more familiar it becomes, and the brain starts to treat it as important. It's not that it's true, but it's well practiced. Breaking that cycle doesn't mean forcing it away, but gradually introducing new ways of thinking and responding.
That makes a lot of sense, especially the idea that familiarity can be mistaken for truth. Just because a thought shows up often doesn't mean it's accurate, it might just be a habit. And like any habit, it can be changed over time, even if it feels difficult at first. I think this is where patience becomes really important. People often want immediate results, but changing thought patterns is more like a gradual process. Small shifts repeated consistently can eventually create a big difference in how we experience our minds.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to set realistic expectations. If someone has been experiencing harmful thoughts for years, it's not going to disappear overnight. But that doesn't mean progress isn't happening. Sometimes progress looks like noticing the thought a little sooner or reacting to it with slightly less intensity. Those are meaningful changes. Another helpful approach can be to label thoughts when they arise, like saying, "This is a worried thought," or "This is a critical thought." That simple act can create distance.
I've actually tried that labeling technique, and it's surprisingly effective. It almost feels like you're stepping outside of the thought for a moment and observing it instead of being inside it. And that shift can reduce the emotional impact even if the thought is still there. It reminds you that you're not the thought itself, you're the one noticing it. I think that distinction is really empowering. It gives you a sense of separation, which can make the experience feel less overwhelming and more manageable.
That separation is key, and it connects to a broader idea of mindfulness. When we practice being present and aware, we become better at noticing thoughts without immediately reacting. It's not about clearing the mind completely, but about changing how we relate to what's happening inside it. Even a few moments of awareness can interrupt the automatic cycle of thought and reaction. Over time, that can lead to a more stable and calm mental state, even when difficult thoughts still appear.
I like that you mentioned mindfulness because it doesn't have to be complicated or formal. It can be as simple as taking a breath and noticing what's going on in your mind without judgment. I think people sometimes feel intimidated by the idea of mindfulness, but it's really just about awareness, and that awareness can be practiced in small, everyday moments. The more we practice it, the more natural it becomes to step back from harmful thoughts instead of getting caught up in them.
That's a great way to put it, keeping it simple and approachable. I'd also add that it's okay if it doesn't work perfectly every time. There will be moments when thoughts feel overwhelming, and that's part of the process. The goal isn't perfection, but progress. Even noticing that you got caught up in a thought after the fact is still awareness. It still counts. And over time, those moments of awareness tend to happen earlier, which makes it easier to respond in a more balanced way.
That's really encouraging, especially for people who feel like they're not doing it right. There's no perfect way to manage your thoughts. It's a personal process, and it can look different for everyone. What matters is finding approaches that feel supportive rather than punishing. If something helps you feel a little more grounded or a little less overwhelmed, that's valuable. I think we often underestimate how much small moments of relief can add up over time.
I completely agree. And I think that idea of small moments adding up is something people can hold on to. Change doesn't always come in big, dramatic shifts. Often it's subtle and gradual. But those small changes can transform how we experience our minds in the long run. When we combine awareness, patience, and self-compassion, we start to build a healthier relationship with our minds. And that relationship is what ultimately shapes our day-to-day experience more than any single thought ever could.
As we move further into this conversation, I think it's helpful to talk about what we can actually do in those moments when harmful thoughts feel really intense. Because understanding them is one thing, but being in the middle of it can feel completely different. One thing that has helped me is grounding myself in the present moment, like focusing on my surroundings or my breathing. It sounds simple, but it can interrupt that spiral of thoughts. It's like reminding yourself that you're here, you're safe, and the thought is just passing through.
That's a really practical approach, Anna. And I think grounding techniques can be incredibly effective because they shift attention away from the mental loop and back into the body or environment. When a thought feels overwhelming, the mind tends to narrow its focus, almost like it's stuck in a tunnel. Grounding helps widen that perspective again. Another strategy I found helpful is writing the thought down. When you see it on paper, it often looks different, sometimes less powerful or even a bit exaggerated compared to how it felt in your head.
I've experienced that too, especially the part where thoughts seem less intimidating once they're written down. It's almost like taking them out of your mind reduces their intensity. And sometimes, when you look at them, you can question them more clearly. You might ask, is this actually true? Or is there another way to see this situation? That doesn't mean we're forcing positivity, but we're opening the door to alternative perspectives. That flexibility can make a big difference when a thought feels very rigid or absolute.
That's such an important distinction, not forcing positivity, but allowing flexibility. Harmful thoughts often come in very extreme forms like always or never or everything is wrong. Challenging those extremes gently can help bring things back to a more balanced view. Another thing I think is useful is talking to someone you trust. Sometimes just saying a thought out loud can immediately change how it feels. What seemed overwhelming in your head can feel more manageable when shared with another person who can offer perspective.
Yes, and I think that connection piece is so powerful. When we keep harmful thoughts to ourselves, they can grow in isolation. But when we share them, even just a little, it breaks that sense of being alone. Of course, it's important to choose someone who feels safe and understanding. Not everyone will respond in the way we need, and that's okay. But having even one person who listens without judgment can make a huge difference. It reminds us that we don't have to carry everything by ourselves.
Definitely. And for those who might not feel ready to share with someone else, even speaking to yourself in a kinder way can help. The way we talk to ourselves matters a lot. If a harmful thought shows up and we respond with more criticism, it can escalate quickly. But if we respond with something like, "This is a difficult moment, but I can handle it," it creates a different emotional tone. It's not about denying the difficulty, but about supporting yourself through it.
I really like that idea because it feels realistic and compassionate at the same time. We're not pretending everything is fine, but we're also not making it worse. I think a lot of people underestimate how powerful their inner voice is. It can either amplify harmful thoughts or help soften them. And developing a kinder inner voice takes practice, especially if we're used to being self-critical. But even small changes in how we speak to ourselves can start to shift that pattern over time.
That's very true, and I think consistency plays a big role here. These strategies, whether it's grounding, writing, or self-talk, might not feel natural at first, but the more we use them, the more familiar they become. Over time, they can become almost automatic responses to harmful thoughts. It's like building a toolkit that you can rely on when things get difficult. And knowing that you have those tools can also reduce anxiety because you feel more prepared to handle whatever comes up.
Having that sense of preparedness really does make a difference. It's like you're no longer completely at the mercy of your thoughts. Even if they show up, you have ways to respond. And I think it's also important to accept that some days will be harder than others. Progress isn't a straight line. There will be setbacks, and that's okay. What matters is how we respond to those setbacks, whether we treat them as failures or as part of the learning process.
I'm really glad you brought that up because setbacks can be discouraging if we expect constant improvement, but in reality, they're part of growth. Each difficult moment can teach us something about our patterns, triggers, or needs, and the more we learn, the better we can support ourselves in the future. It's a gradual process of understanding and adapting. There's no finish line where harmful thoughts disappear completely, but there is a point where they no longer control us in the same way.
That perspective feels very honest and reassuring. It shifts the goal from never having harmful thoughts again to not being controlled by them, and that feels much more achievable. I think when people realize that they don't have to be perfect, it takes a lot of pressure off. They can focus on building resilience instead. And resilience isn't about avoiding difficulty. It's about learning how to move through it with a bit more strength and understanding each time.
Exactly, and I think that's a great way to frame it. We're not trying to eliminate part of the human experience, but to navigate it more skillfully. Harmful thoughts may always exist to some degree, but they don't have to define us or dictate our actions. With awareness, practice, and support, we can create a healthier relationship with our minds. And that in itself can lead to a more peaceful and balanced way of living, even when challenges arise.
As we start to wrap up today's episode, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge how important this conversation is. Talking about harmful thoughts isn't always easy, and even listening to it can bring up personal experiences. So if you've stayed with us through this discussion, that already says a lot about your willingness to understand yourself better. I hope this episode has helped you feel a little less alone and maybe given you a new way to look at your thoughts, not as something to fear, but as something you can learn to navigate with care.
I completely agree, Anna. And I think one of the key takeaways from today is that having harmful thoughts does not define who you are. It's something that happens within the mind, not a reflection of your character or your values. The more we can separate ourselves from those thoughts, the more freedom we create. It doesn't mean the thoughts disappear, but they lose their ability to control how we feel and act. That shift, even if it's small, can have a really meaningful impact over time.
Yes, and I think it's also worth reminding everyone that this is an ongoing process. There's no point where you suddenly have everything figured out and never struggle again, and that's okay. Growth is not about perfection, it's about progress. Some days will feel easier and others might feel challenging, but each moment is an opportunity to practice a different response. Even noticing a harmful thought without immediately reacting is a step forward, and those small steps truly matter more than we often realize.
That's such an important reminder, especially for people who might feel discouraged when things don't change quickly. It's easy to underestimate gradual progress because it's not always visible right away. But over time, those small changes build into something much bigger. And I think the most valuable thing you can take from this conversation is the idea of treating yourself with patience and understanding. You're not in a race, and you're not expected to handle everything perfectly. You're just learning, one step at a time.
And if there's one thing I hope people carry with them after listening, it's that they don't have to face these thoughts alone. Whether it's talking to a friend, a family member, or a professional, reaching out can make a huge difference. There's strength in sharing, even when it feels uncomfortable at first. And if you're not ready to talk yet, that's okay too. Just knowing that support exists can be comforting. You deserve to feel supported, especially during the moments that feel the hardest.
Absolutely. And I'd also encourage listeners to be curious about their own minds rather than critical. Curiosity opens the door to understanding, while criticism often shuts it down. When you approach your thoughts with curiosity, you create space to learn and grow. It's a gentler and more sustainable way of dealing with difficult experiences. Over time, that mindset can transform not only how you deal with harmful thoughts, but how you relate to yourself as a whole.
I really love that idea of curiosity because it feels so much lighter than judgment. It allows room for exploration instead of fear. And I think that's what we've been trying to emphasize throughout this episode, that your thoughts don't have to be something you fight constantly. They can be something you observe, understand, and gradually learn from. It doesn't mean it's always easy, but it does mean it's possible to change the way you experience them, even if just a little at first.
And those smaller changes, as we've said, really do add up. Over time, they can lead to a greater sense of calm and confidence in your ability to handle whatever comes up. It's not about having a perfectly quiet mind, but about having a steady and supportive relationship with your thoughts. That kind of relationship can make a big difference in how you move through daily life, especially during stressful or uncertain times, when harmful thoughts are more likely to appear.
Before we close, I just want to say thank you to everyone listening. Your time and attention mean a lot to us, and we hope this conversation has brought you some comfort or clarity. If something resonated with you, maybe take a moment to reflect on it after this episode. Even one small insight can be meaningful. And remember, you're doing better than you think, even on the days when it doesn't feel that way.
Thank you all for being here with us today. We really appreciate you taking the time to listen and reflect. If this episode helped you, feel free to share it with someone who might need it too. These conversations become even more powerful when they reach others. And as always, we'll be back with more discussions like this, exploring the thoughts and experiences that connect us all. Until next time, take care of yourselves and be a little kinder to your own mind.